In the tumultuous days of the 2022 presidential and vice presidential election in the Philippines, the Uniteam Alliance ticket, featuring the son and daughter of two previous Filipino presidents, vied for the positions of president and vice president. A united campaign by the powerful political families of Marcos and Duterte led to the election of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the president, and Sara Duterte, the vice president. The Marcos cabinet appointed Vice President Duterte as a member and vice chairperson of the anti-insurgency task force. The combination of two powerful factions in Philippine politics would most likely be short-lived, but it is not an understatement that the two would split so dramatically. Given the current state of Philippine politics, it was unrealistic to anticipate that the Uniteam Alliance would remain intact. The Philippines limits the president to a single 6-year term, and Vice President Duterte, with her own presidential aspirations, is poised to succeed him in 2028. At some point, she would have to split with President Marcos if she wanted to continue to receive support from her father's supporters, former President Rodrigo Duterte, who is a sharp critic of President Marcos and his political faction. Vice President Duterte would also need to differentiate herself from President Marcos to solidify her political position. The break between Marcos and Duterte started in early 2024, as there was suspicion from Duterte that factions were destroying her reputation. That would not be unexpected, as other politicians with presidential aspirations would start sniping at the apparent presidential frontrunner for the 2028 elections. The break came on June 19, 2024, when Vice President Duterte announced her resignation from the Marcos government, effective on July 19, 2024. Neither Duterte nor Marcos explicitly stated the reason for the resignation, except for personal or work issues. Vice President Duterte resigned solely from her cabinet positions, not from her office as vice president. A month after her resignation in August 2024, the vice president cited disagreements over the national budget and President Marcos's aggressive and confrontational approach to territorial disputes with China in the West Philippine Sea as reasons for her resignation. Other issues, such as the statement that Marcos was unfit for office, were also cited, but these are the kinds of reasons one would expect to start differentiating policies in preparation for a presidential run in 2028. This is necessary, as the Marcos and Duterte political factions are far apart on many domestic and international issues, so she needed to break the alliance at some point to keep her strong political position for 2028. Tensions skyrocketed between the two when Vice President Duterte held an early morning online press conference on Saturday, November 23, 2024, in Manila. Vice President Duterte stated that if she had been in contact with an assassin, and that if she were killed, the assassin was to kill President Marcos, his wife Liza Araneta, and the Speaker of the Philippine House, Martin Romualdez. Romualdez is a close ally of President Marcos and is the president's cousin. She stated that this was not a joke, and that the assassin understands that he is not to stop until he has killed all three. She claimed to have received a threat while visiting Congress, where her chief of staff, Zuleika Lopez, was under detention for contempt due to alleged interference in a probe into Duterte's misappropriation of confidential funds. The vice president attempted to physically intervene in stopping the transfer of Ms. Lopez from Congress's holding area to a women's correctional detention center by being in the same cell with her chief of staff. Duterte stated that she was acting as Ms. Lopez's attorney in an apparent obstruction attempt. The vice president is a lawyer, but the Philippine Constitution prohibits the president and vice president from practicing any other profession while in office. This action by Duterte reportedly prompted an online commentator to warn her that she was in enemy territory, presumably referring to Congress, and to exercise caution. She assumed that this was a death threat. The threat from the vice president resulted in increased security around the president, his family, and Speaker Romualdez. The Presidential Security Command is investigating the threat in anticipation of possible action against Vice President Duterte. Duterte's specific threat clearly warrants an investigation. The question is, why did Duterte make such a public threat, which was clearly illegal, considering she was the clear frontrunner for 2028? Duterte is facing pressure from the investigation that resulted in the contempt arrest of her chief of staff. Additionally, the International Criminal Court is investigating her father, the former president, for crimes against humanity related to his anti-drug crackdown, which is suspected to have involved extrajudicial killings of minor drug offenders. The reason for her lapse in judgment remains unclear, but it has jeopardized her political career and potentially sparked political turmoil in the Philippines, as two political factions could escalate their rivalry to dangerous levels, given the country's ongoing, low-level insurgency. The Philippines under President Marcos Jr. has been more aggressive against China over territorial disputes in the West Philippine Sea when compared to his predecessor, President Rodrigo Duterte. President Duterte took a much less confrontational stance with China and was more distant with the US when compared to President Marcos. China is likely to view the upheaval in the Philippines favorably, as a political crisis in the country could present an opportunity for China to assert its claims. The concept posits that a Philippines preoccupied with internal politics and a political crisis could become distracted and less capable of confronting an external threat. This is an opportunity for China to press its claims in the West Philippine Sea. This does not imply that China is the initiator of this political dispute, despite the possibility of being the immediate victor. General Romeo Brawner, the Chief of Staff of the Philippine Armed Forces, has stated that the Philippine Armed Forces will remain apolitical in the political dispute. This implies that there won't be an instantaneous shift in Philippine policy in the region. However, as the crisis persists, it's plausible that the Philippines' standing in the region could deteriorate due to a lack of firm or distinct guidance from the political leadership. Another reason is that President Marcos Jr. does not require direct political support to maintain his position, as he still has allies in Congress. The ultimate rationale stems from the expectation that Duterte, should she emerge as the likely presidential candidate, would adopt a less confrontational, if not altogether more favorable stance towards China. China is not in a position to jeopardize the political prospects of Vice President Duterte. In fact, the opposite would be the case. It is unclear what will happen politically in the Philippines. President Marcos had originally refused to work with the ICC in its criminal investigation of former President Duterte, but now may be more willing to work with them in their investigation. We anticipate the imposition of criminal charges or sanctions on Vice President Duterte as a result of her openly and clearly expressed threat. Political forces were already working against Vice President Duterte, which was not unexpected. However, it now appears that her actions could trigger reactions that would disadvantage the Duterte political faction in 2028 and pave the way for President Marcos's preferred successor.